Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. Today, a car you probably haven't seen in a little bit, haven't had it out in a while. This is my 72 Imperial LeBaron. Not a Chrysler Imperial, but an Imperial. This car has, it's getting close to 13,000 miles now, and it is huge. This is close to the longest passenger car, non-limousine passenger car ever produced. That honor would be bestowed upon the 73 Imperial, which was longer by a couple inches because it had bigger bumper guards in the rear and then also bumper guards up front. But otherwise, this thing is just massive. I mean, look at the sheet metal. This is close to the end of the run for the fuselage era Chryslers that were launched in 1969. And as I said, this is a 72. Chrysler did redo the styling for 1972 and completely different front end look with these almost woodlight style parking lamps and of course hidden headlamps, as was the trend in this time frame, particularly with Fords. GM wasn't big into hidden headlights on many cars, but Ford definitely was. GM did have some. But this huge grille with the rectangle within a rectangle theme up front. I love the 72 grille theme as opposed to the 73, which has different texture. But look at how complicated the stamping is back then of these forms. You got this filleted surface, and then a lot of the, I would say, Cadillacs and the Lincolns of the era. I think Imperial was trying to do something different because the Cadillacs and the Lincolns would have a shoulder that would come out to about here from either side, and you have this area that was raised. Here, think about Imperial has pulled the shoulder further outward, almost all the way to the edge of the hood. And I think it gives it a super cool look. Then you've got this very small little fillet here, and catwalk area in between the fender peak and the prow of the hood. This is very small compared to what you'd see on other cars of the era. So between the woodlight style parking lamps, that huge rectangle within a rectangle grille, the hood with that prow that is massive, you have a very distinctive look up front for Imperial. In fact, some people criticize these as looking like they were driving in reverse up front. I think General Motors stylists thought that. I can see that, but you know what? I think it looks cool. So what? Now, as I said, this was kind of the waning era of the fuselage cars from Chrysler. And those would run from 69 to 73 in the full-size form. And this car, look at this, it's just massive. Massive sheet metal stamping, so massive, in fact, that if you look at the quarter panel, you can kind of see some dimples up near this fold. It's really tough to see. You kind of have to walk around the car and watch the reflection. That's not because this car has been dented. That's because that quarter panel is so massive. And I don't think they were able to stamp it all that effectively and make that turn where it folds over without the sheet metal creasing, just because it was so big. And during this era, the quality wasn't always that great, particularly on Chrysler cars. Although this one, you know, the gaps are a little large, but they're not offensive, and they seem pretty uniform. So not bad for Chrysler of the era. I mean, this was an Imperial after all. Imperial would be its own division at Chrysler until 1975. Then the top Chrysler would become the New Yorker Brougham. And it would be the New Yorker Brougham until the 1981 model year when the bustleback style Imperial would come out that would run from 81 to 83. Now, the Imperial, while it was a full-size C-body-like car, did get some interesting features that were novel and were unique to Imperial. In particular, the front suspension and the subframe. These are unibody cars. The front subframe is unique to Imperial and has better isolation than the Chryslers. And there were a couple different, I think, steps of the unibody here. At the upper end was the Imperial that had its unique subframe, heavily rubber isolated, quite effective. This car's pretty quiet at speed. Then if you got, I believe, certainly a Chrysler or a Dodge, you had a different front subframe that wasn't as well isolated, but it was bolted to the body with rubber mounts, big thick rubber mounts, to give you a quiet ride. Then if you got a Plymouth, well, heck, they just bolted the subframe directly to the body. No rubber isolators. So it's kind of funny how Chrysler went about this. This car, of course, has Chrysler's torsion bar front suspension, leaf spring rear, which Chrysler's had since 1957. And it endows the car with, I would say, a pretty stiff ride. Some people didn't like Chryslers of this era because of that ride. Kind of a truck-like ride. But you can clearly see the leaf springs down here, right there, with Teflon liners, resonator as well. This car is quiet. Now, one thing I will tell you, and it's kind of funny about these leaf spring Chryslers that you got to be a little careful on. When you jack them up, sometimes the leaf shackle inverts, and then you've got to get it back to the appropriate setting. It actually happened on this car when I was changing a tire one time. I jacked it up, I put the car back down, and the left side was still way high. And I thought, well, maybe it's just because I jacked it up. And I looked underneath, and the leaf shackle had inverted. I mean, they basically pivot like this, and it had pivoted in the opposite direction. So if you have that issue, don't fret. I just put a tow strap on it, jacked the car back up, and made sure that it had tension on it as I put it back down, and then it was fine. Now, the back end on these was also new for 72. Actually, when this Imperial was introduced in 69, it had sequential tail lamps with the same mechanism from the Ford Thunderbird of the era. But here you have these kind of Gothic style cathedral tail lights, I want to say. And they look pretty cool. The bumper is kind of scalloped out in the middle there, helping make this car look somewhat slimmer, although I think the chunkiness of it, particularly in this area, is not helping it. I think the designers were trying to make it look a little bit slimmer, but it looks a little heavy to me in this era. Still looks good though. That's the reverse lamp right in the middle. Super well integrated and cool. And of course, does anybody know what those little slots are for? Well, that's if you got to jack the car up. That's the jack area. I would say if you have one of these cars today, even back in the day, don't ever use those for the jack, because oftentimes you'll disfigure the bumper at least slightly. And you don't want to do that, especially on a car like this that you're never going to find parts. Now, your Imperial you could get in 2-door or 4-door hardtop form. They made only about between 10 and 15,000 of these toward the end of the run each year. They were very rare. Ooh, there's that buzzer. Turn that off. But what a cool interior. This one has the gold leather, and it's just in fantastic shape. And cool thing about these doors, you get little pockets here you can store things in. Interestingly, I don't think this is that well designed, because on all the doors, this padding interferes with the door panel, so you can only open it about that far. You'd think you'd want to be able to rotate it higher. And despite the fact that it's cool, you have this cheap little snap that secures it if you want it secured. So kind of a half-hearted attempt there at something that is pretty cool. Lincoln would do that on some door panels. Of course, you have faux wood grain everywhere, but look at that door handle. Massive door handle. Ashtray. Dome light. You do have your own dome lights back here. And a head pillow and a lavalier strap that rocks out and can help you get in and out of the car. These door panels are super thickly padded up top with this mold-in stitching, fake stitching, and the casket handle style door pulls. This portion is all soft. Of course, you have the lamp at the bottom. This is interestingly hard plastic, and they should have done something a little better for the Imperial. But one thing about Chrysler during this era is they always had really, really nice door openings. Look how wide this door swings open. And then this seat in the front is almost all the way back, and there is a ton of legroom. In your Ford or in your Chrysler, that was not, in your Ford or in your GM car, that was not always the case. But Chrysler generally gave you generous legroom in the rear, and it's not because these seats are thinly padded. One other thing that Chrysler did that GM rarely did is you have the box cushion design here modeled after the Barcelona chair. But you notice you actually have the separate cushion on the bottom as well as the top. If you look at cars like the Olds 98 Regency from 1972 and in the 70s, the bottom cushion is never separate. It's always integrated, and it's the back one that is separate. I think GM did that for durability and probably cost, because you got an extra seam here that you've got to stitch in as well, and some extra padding. You've got 2 layers of padding. Now look at the controls here and how many window switches. This car does have the optional power vent window. These are GM motors in here, but if you turn the key on and watch, oh, that's the main window. Look at that. That's luxury power vent windows. And of course, it was a Chrysler, which meant the clientele was older, so everybody smoked. You also notice with the door open, you have this fasten belts and lock doors signal that turns on. Once you close the door, that'll stay illuminated for about 5 to 10 seconds, something in that zip code, just to remind you to close it. Let's try it. I'll actually close the door here. Notice that it stays open, or sorry, it stays on. And it'll stay on for, like I said, probably 5 to 10 seconds, and then it'll go off. It doesn't go off, interestingly, with the key. It's just on some sort of a time delay, which I don't hear anything ticking, so I'm not sure how they affected that or created that delay in here. Now, some interesting quirks about this car. We mentioned the power vent windows that are, there we go, went off, that are made by GM. You have the tilt telescoping wheel as well. Here's the telescope function. You can move it in and out. And this is actually a GM steering column. So you got a GM column, GM power windows, and Chrysler, of course, had to be different. So they put you put your key in your Chrysler with the cut side facing up. GM, it would be this way. And they did that allegedly because it was better in cold weather for the tumblers to get them to activate. I don't know if it was or not, but that is what Chrysler did. You also have the Auto Temp 2 system. We'll take a look under the hood to see that. This was actually used by Mercedes as well, automatic climate control, with multiple fan speeds. And thankfully, because Mercedes used it, there are people who rebuild these boxes under the hood. There's one big control box in these Auto Temp 2s. And the housings were made of plastic originally. Coolant flows through them, so plastic plus coolant equals great things happening over time. Plastic and electronics and water. Now, because this was an Imperial, you got the very fancy faux wood grain all over the dash. Actually, in some model years, like my friend's 69 Imperial, the wood grain is on the backside of these markings on the dash. Pretty humorous. Made it a bit hard to read. Thankfully, that was gone by this point. You did get 3-speed wipers in your Chrysler. Cadillac also had that. Lincoln would only have 2-speed wipers. You could get an intermittent feature, though. And you have 4 vents, 4 AC outlet vents on these. Here, here, and then down here. There are little bleed air vents, for those who don't know, up under here. See it there? You can swivel that. And that gives you some air out the bottom as well. There are no crotch cooler vents on these like the GMs would have, but that you can do and gets you a little better airflow. Other interesting thing about these, notice you still have the kick well vents on this car despite the fact that it has automatic climate control. Generally on the Fords and GMs, when you got air conditioning, those would go away, but not in your Chrysler because people were old-fashioned. So you have the vent pole there and the vent pole there. I don't like the driver's side one blowing on my feet. It is a beautiful day. It kind of blows on your leg, not my favorite. Now, notice you have this cloth headliner, actually really well done. And for whatever reason, they have padding every other, in between every other roof bow. So this is padded, this is not padded, not. Something structural is running here. That's probably why they didn't do it but kind of an interesting quirk. As I said, you have the lavalier straps and the head pillows. Nobody else gave you the comfort in the back seat that Imperial did. Of course, you have a full armrest as well. Now, returning up here to the front, we were talking about the air conditioning vents. This one doesn't have too many, just 4 up top. And on the next Imperial, the next generation that came out in '74, Chrysler would actually advertise, I think it had 6 or 8 vents. It had 2, 2, and 2 on the driver's side, I think. And they would advertise, well, look at how many vents it has. You know, it's going to cool better. Well, what about the previous model year car that you had? I guess it sucked. And actually the air conditioning in these, the V-twin Chrysler compressor that we'll talk about in a second, is very, very good and effective. But I always thought that was funny that they were basically kind of poking themselves in the eye of the previous model generation. You do have hard A-pillar trim up here, no padding, although this dash is very thickly padded, much more so than if this were a regular Chrysler. Once you get to here, this is the same as the Chrysler, the instruments are the same as the Chrysler, but this portion of the IP is unique to Imperial and super padded. Let's take a look under the hood. At the massive 440 cubic inch Chrysler V8, Chrysler's largest V8 that they had ever produced to this point. Let's see, this is not an easy one-handed operation, but I got it. Interestingly, the hood doesn't open very tall on these. That's as high as it goes. It's hard to see, but most hoods would extend further. So 225 net horsepower. There's the AutoTemp 2 box. I replaced this one with a rebuilt unit. I got it on eBay. Somebody was rebuilding these. I don't know if he still does, but you notice he creates it out of a metal housing. And all the vacuum hoses and everything go into this. I will say another thing about these 440s of this era. You know, they're great engines, very reliable. I think '72 was the last year for the forged crankshaft in the 440. In '73 it was not any longer. But doing a tune-up on these cars is not fun. I mean, it's tough. I mean, you can imagine trying to get your hand in here between the power steering hose and the oil dipstick to change the spark plugs. I find the easiest way is from the bottom, but it is not a fun tune-up. Probably my least favorite of any car of the era. Sometimes the GMs that have the air conditioning compressor over here, it's a little hard to get those spark plugs. If you want to know what to do, easiest thing, you don't have to remove anything. Keep the air conditioning compressor there. Jack the car up, remove the passenger side tire. The 2 spark plugs are right there. So, one extra step, but not bad. Of course, that's the Chrysler V-twin air conditioning compressor that I mentioned before. Works very, very well on these. And you have the Highland Park Hummingbird starter. Some people always say, well, why don't you put a new starter in your Chrysler so it starts more quickly? I don't want it to start more quickly. I want the vintage sound of a Chrysler. Let's listen to it. And the engine's warm, so it might crank for a couple seconds too, so you can hear it a little longer. Let's see. There we go. Look at that. Gotta love your Chrysler. No other starter sounded like that. Let's hear it one more time. You ready? Oh yeah. Nice and quiet. Yeah, the 440 is great in these, as is the Torque Flight 727 transmission. Notice the gap here. This is why these cars, there's none of them left, because they did so well in demolition derbies. Look at the gap between the grille and the radiator. I mean, it's just massive. And you have all of these gussets and supports for the subframe. So it's very, very strong and sturdy up front. Well, there's still a witness mark on this side and on this side. You do have to watch your head though. One of the terrible features of this, because the hood doesn't open that tall, you're apt to bump your head on this, and let me tell you, it hurts. Another interesting thing about these is the hood insulation pad only extends in this portion of the hood, not here. And well, it's just open space, but I do find that funny that it's a pretty thin hood insulation pad too. It's not thicker like some of the others. So Chrysler cheaped out a little bit, had to save some money. Let's take a look at the hidden headlamps. We'll put them on. You can see there's a single motor, and that is what powers both of the headlamp doors. Now another interesting, and they slam closed with authority. Now another interesting feature for 72 is, notice what's there on the firewall. That is the Chrysler electronic ignition box, which Chrysler was an early pioneer in electronic ignition, which sounds good. No points in this car. But the system wasn't all that great, I would say. That box sometime failed. And then here you can see the white piece. That's the infamous Chrysler ballast resistor. And what happens when those go bad, and they particularly go bad in wet weather, is you'll be able to start the car, but then it's like you instantly shut the key off. The car will start and just shut off instantly. If that's your symptom, it's a ballast resistor. Best thing you can do, keep one in the glove box. Any Mopar fan keeps a spare ballast resistor in the glove box, because they are known to fail, like I said, particularly in wet weather, which is why you see Chryslers broken down on the side of the road sometimes. So just a sweet car, super unique. They only made about 10 to 15,000 of these Imperials typically every year. You know, I think they didn't sell well in part because Chrysler priced their vehicles pretty high. A Chrysler New Yorker, as an example, was priced the same as an Olds 98, between a 98 and a 98 LS. And if you look at a Chrysler New Yorker, not a Brougham, just a New Yorker, and you compare it to an Olds 98, it just wasn't the same. And I think as a consequence, they priced high to discount high, which meant the residual value stunk. And I think that was really a challenge for buyers in the space, because Cadillacs had excellent residual value. So why buy the Imperial when you could get the Cadillac with the best residual value in the marketplace? This thing, the second you drove it off the dealer lot, you lost 25–30% of what you paid for it, or at least I'll call it off of MSRP, maybe not what you paid for it. And by this point, they were starting to use a lot more Chrysler components in the sheet metal on these Imperials. Actually, the roof is an example, the glass, the A-pillars. They did do something interesting here, which is put this plug to make the backlight smaller versus the Chrysler. So this is padded here. It's not padded on the side, but there's padding here, and there's a fiberglass cap that shrinks the size of the rear window to give it a more formal, so-called Frenched-in backlight would be the term for that. But just a massive car, super cleanly styled. You know, what I love about these fuselage era cars is they're very simple in terms of execution. Look at the body side. There's really no creases, so to speak of. There's just this kind of convex shape, barrel roll to the midsection. It does then come in, and then you have this fillet before it kind of points outward and then back and tucks under. You can probably see it better if I open the door and you look at it. But very simple, elegant styling. And these cars are also super tall compared to GM and Fords of the era. The cowl height and the overall roof height is enormous compared to a GM and Ford, which would have been lower. I mean, this, I'm 6'1", a little over 6'1", and this portion of the car is above my waist. On a GM car, this would probably be about here. Another 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches lower. And you get a little bit of the pinched greenhouse look because the belt line is so high. You also sit up pretty tall in these Chryslers. It's almost like a modern day SUV seating position. There we go. We'll just take it for a quick ride around the block. You can hear the engine fan. They have these set up so that if you're idling, because you're going to be using the automatic climate control, the fan's really spinning fast. Once we get going a little bit, it'll calm down. But how cool to have one of these cars today. By the way, another quirk of these, no turn signal in the dash. You put the turn signal on, you don't see anything. There's no light in the dash. The Chryslers had it. In fact, there's a provision for it in the dash, but there's nothing there. So how do you know your turn signal's on? You got to look at the end of the fender, and there's a lamp there. So that's how you know your turn signal's working on your Chrysler. So there you have it, a pretty sweet old ride, the New Yorker. What do you think? This is one of my favorite cars that I have. You just don't see these anywhere anymore. And I will say other quirks and features that you might think are cool. This is the speaker fader for the radio. Then you've got the map light switch here. And then you have the power antenna switch. So, a couple neat switches. The clock, of course. Just a cool old car. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on this Imperial. Thanks again for watching.